After publicly pretending he would at least consider reducing the number of Americans in harm's way in Iraq, President Bush 1 year ago tonight announced the surge of more troops, eventually up to 170,000. And our third story tonight, 1 year later, fallen from the front pages, but still uppermost in voters' minds. Did the surge in Iraq work? In an op-ed today, Senators John McCain and Joe Lieberman predictably write, quote, "Conditions in that country have been utterly transformed from those of a year ago as a consequence of the surge." While correct in its implication that violence has fallen dramatically, they are on shakier ground, crediting the surge for that. Ethnic cleansing, that pleasant euphemism for genocide and fear, has reduced sectarian violence. An estimated 10% of Iraqis having fled their homes. The UN estimating approximately 1 million fled to Syria alone last year. Also, Anbar militias broke ties with al-Qaeda in Iraq before the surge. This Tuesday, the U.S. launched a massive new operation targeting AIQ in its new stronghold in northern Iraq that resulted in 9 U.S. fatalities. Many militia leaders, such as Muqtada al-Sadr, now have at least informal truces with the U.S., perhaps in part because the U.S. has decided to tolerate the less extreme ones. Both Republicans and pseudo-Republicans acknowledge the real goal of the surge, political change to ensure future stability, remains unmet. As Mr. Bush upheld his vow to hold Iraq to the 2007 benchmarks, sharing oil revenues with the people? No. Local elections to empower Sunnis? No. Return of low-level Baathists to government? No. Constitutional review? No. Iraqi control of all provinces? No. 18 Iraqi brigades in Baghdad? No. Let's turn now to Washington Post military correspondent Thomas Ricks, author of the definitive war chronicle Fiasco, the American military adventure in Iraq. Once again, great thanks for your time, sir.
You're welcome.
You're right. You wrote today that despite the blood and the treasure we were told were worth building Mr. Bush's vision of democracy in Iraq, he and General Petraeus have essentially decided, forget the benchmarks, we'll let the Iraqis do what they want. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. The phrase you hear a lot is Iraqi solutions for Iraqi problems. It's been around a while, but it's become very popular in the last 6 months. And essentially what it means is, hey, we tried for 4 years to impose a solution here. It didn't work. Okay, let the Iraqis figure it out.
Why is that suddenly an acceptable idea now when a year or two earlier that was considered cut and run?
Because we tried everything else and it didn't work. And as Winston Churchill said, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing once they've tried everything else. And that's kind of where we're at now. The solutions we tried to impose were rejected, fell apart, weren't sustainable. It also represents in some ways an accommodation. They're talking about Sunnis and Shiites reconciling. It's also Americans reconciling themselves to reality and saying, what we hoped you'd have here is not going to happen, so let's try for something at least sustainable and secure.
You also wrote that once peace is established in Sunni areas, that central Shiite government intends to disband the local Sunni militias. Well, how on earth could that go wrong?
There's a huge fight brewing there. I heard an American officer told me that the insurgents he was working with, the Sunni insurgents, said once they take care of al-Qaeda, they're turning their guns on the government. This is not real pleasing to the Baghdad government, that the Americans are paying these people money and making promises to them, and these are the same people who intend to go after the Shiite government at some point.
If the goal of the surge was, as stated a year ago tonight, to prevent the American blood being shed in Iraq, obviously we could have accomplished that by never going there. Likewise, the fictional Iraqi WMDs, that phrase about Iraqi solutions for Iraqi problems rings oddly historically. But, I mean, the problems that Mr. Bush caused here, al-Qaeda in Iraq, does not the concessions to Iraqi solutions amount to a declaration of surrender on the economic and the political vision that the president claimed was worth thousands of American lives?
It certainly is a way of kind of moonwalking away from those goals while still giving them a head nod and saying, look, if this isn't going to happen, let's at least have these guys cobble together something so we can get out of here eventually.
So a year later, when Senators Lieberman and McCain get all choked up about how the surge has worked, are they at or are they at least getting close to that old morbid joke about the doctor telling the family, well, the operation was a success, but I'm afraid I have to tell you the patient died?
Well, from their perspective, perhaps the surge is a success. As you said in the introduction, Iraq is no longer on the front pages every day. And for some politicians, that might be exactly the definition of success they were looking for. But yeah, judged on the terms in which the president presented it, the surge has not worked. The purpose of the surge was to improve security, but to improve it to lead to a political breakthrough. And that political breakthrough has not happened. It was supposed to happen by last summer. That was the theory of the surge. So the theory of the surge is now demonstrably false. We're into 2008, and it hasn't happened. So there's a big question, okay, if the breakthrough doesn't happen, what do we do next?
Do the Iraqis think it has worked?
I think Iraqis recognize that large parts of Baghdad are more peaceful than they were, but the violence is basically back to 2005 levels. And that was no picnic, 2005. It was just 2006 was pure hell.
Thomas Ricks of The Washington Post, author of Fiasco. Again, great thanks.
You're welcome.
A quick footnote about culpability in Iraq. In the last ongoing court-martial related to Abu Ghraib, the U.S. Army today tossed out the conviction of Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Jordan. He was accused not of torture, but of disobeying an order to not discuss the investigation of abuses at Abu Ghraib, the U.S. prison, the infamous one in Iraq. The end of Jordan's case is a milestone in the investigation because it now means not a single officer will be convicted for their roles in the torture scandal that blemished America's already tarnished reputation. Only one person, Charles Grainer, remains behind bars. Nor will any civilian leaders face punishment, despite General Janis Karpinski's claim that the torture authorization came from the top, from then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld.